In the next 15 minutes, I would like to share a few facts, a few information on clinical trials in the EU, but also outside of the EU. On this photo, you see a young couple, and the woman has cystic fibrosis and she's pregnant. 10, 20 years ago, nobody would have thought that young woman with cystic fibrosis could become pregnant. Even those who developed the new medicines for cystic fibrosis, this woman benefits from, even those developers did not think that this would become a reality. So this information was not even captured in clinical trials. It's only when the product, when the medicine became available, that young woman started to become pregnant again. And this is precious information that can continue to be collected after the clinical trials. So that says that the end of the story, of course, doesn't stop at the end of the clinical trial. There is a lot more we can gain on the benefits of these medicines after they are authorized. We have a European register of clinical trials with 2,800 clinical trials in rare diseases, which are in progress, and many more, 3,200, which are completed. We estimate the number of orphan medicinal products in development in clinical trials to be around 500 and 600. We will soon have a new clinical trial information system, and all the links to this information are in the presentation that maybe you can share with your participants after the conference. So the first point I wanted to make on clinical trials for rare diseases, so which you don't see on the slide, but it's the number of participants which can be enrolled in these clinical trials. And when the rare disease is very rare, which is less than 1 person per million inhabitants, in average, we have 30 persons in a clinical trial for the development of medicines for this disease. In rare diseases which are tenfold more prevalent, we have in average 60 patients in the clinical trials. Tenfold more patients, but only twofold more patients in clinical trials. For rare diseases which are now again even tenfold more prevalent than the second one, we have in average 120 patients in clinical trials. And for the most prevalent rare diseases, we have the same, 120 in average. So it means that there are opportunities to conduct larger clinical trials than what we currently see. The recruitment of clinical trials and the design of the clinical trials is probably not taking the most of the efforts we could make to have larger clinical trials in the most prevalent of the rare diseases. There are challenges to conduct clinical trials in rare diseases. The cost of developing the infrastructure. There are excellent healthcare professionals working in excellent centers with nurses and all the staff. But from there, you cannot start conducting a clinical trial from one day to the next. You need to go through a lot of administrative work before your center can comply with the good clinical principles and all the rules that govern the conduct of clinical trials. You also need to put in place the compensation of the different healthcare professionals. You need to recruit staff, technicians for the clinical trial. You need to have all the lab and equipment. There are rules, for example, you need to collect blood samples and to store them for 6 months or 2 years. And for all your clinical trials. The regulations are quite complex on clinical trials. We have the International Conference on Harmonization, which publishes guidelines on how to conduct clinical trials, but we have also international and national regulations. You need always a critical mass, a certain number of clinical trials in a hospital before you really can invest in conducted clinical trials. Below that certain number, you will not have the necessary resources to guarantee high quality of the clinical trials, which is a problem in many centers for rare diseases. So the best thing to do is to have a dedicated team specialized in conducting clinical trials, which can conduct clinical trials for different rare diseases, for different departments in the hospital, and not just one, because then you won't have enough clinical trials, enough proposals to make the effort worth. So we just started in Europe a new regulation called the Regulation on Clinical Trials, which consists in a brand new clinical trial information system. And all this is to simplify the submission of authorizations for clinical trials. It's one-stop shop, a single European entry point. It's all digitalized, where the sponsor of the clinical trial can submit all the information for the authorization, and the member states concerned, will assess together the scientific aspect of the clinical trial proposal, and each member state individually will look at national rules, how patients in the trial are protected, the insurance, etc. And then the sponsor will receive a coordinated response, and the trial will be followed up using the same system. So it's the end of the old way we had in Europe to obtain authorization for clinical trials, where you had to submit an authorization, a dossier in each country before you can start the trial. Now there is one entry point, plus many other features in this regulation regarding the increased transparency on the clinical trials. For the patients and for doctors, there will be a beautiful public interface, a public registry, where we can have all the information we are looking for on which clinical trials are run in different countries, all the information on the clinical trials of interest, and with easier ways to search for the clinical trial of interest for your disease. And we will have the results of the clinical trials when they will be available in lay language for all patients to understand the outcome of the clinical trials. The other changes to come, there is an international effort to revise the overarching guidelines that guide the conduct of clinical trials. So it's the so-called International Conference on Harmonization. And patients from all world regions are invited to contribute to the revision of this guidance. So EURODIS in particular is very involved in defining how patients need to be engaged in the planning and the conduct of the clinical trials, and ICH will publish guidance on how to best engage with patients for the planning and the conduct of trials. We are also working on completely new types of clinical trials, the so-called decentralized trials or digital trials or virtual trials, where the patients don't need to go to the hospital for everything. They can go to the hospital for some visits, but all the rest can be made from home. They can ship you the trial treatment to where you live or to your pharmacy, and you can enter data with electronic systems remotely without having to visit the hospital always. But we need guidance on how to make this work. We are also working on ACT-EU. ACT-EU, this is to accelerate clinical trials in Europe with multiple countries involved in the same clinical trial. We also have a European project specific to rare diseases, so which I will not show you in detail, but it's called Asterix. And you know that rare diseases are quite different, the one from the others. And some are acute, some are chronic, some have acute crises, but single crises, others have repeated crises. So depending on the characteristics of the disease, you can apply different clinical trial design. So the Asterix project is a guide for clinicians to select the most appropriate clinical trial design and the most appropriate statistical analytic method to respond to the research question. So here we have quite many resources dedicated to help clinicians, investigators, and sponsors design the best possible clinical trials. Another initiative of importance, a report which has just been published in September this year by CIOMS. CIOMS is the Council of International Organizations in Medical Sciences. It was created jointly by the WHO and UNESCO, and CIOMS publishes guidance also on how to conduct research in all diseases, so including rare diseases. And CIOMS just published a report to which EURODIS contributed with other patients on the involvement of patients in the development, the regulation, and the safe use of medicines. And it explains step by step all the opportunities we should have in advising and helping sponsors and organizers of clinical trials to design and organize the best possible trials for the trial participants. So it's published, and when you will receive the presentation, you can click on the link to download the report, which is for free. And it's an important report because it applies universally to all regions in the world, and it encourages, it gives recipes and tools for all those who haven't yet started to work with patients to do so. There are many examples of successful participation of patients in the design and conduct of clinical trials. At EURODIS, we encourage the creation of what are called community advisory boards. Community advisory boards are groups of 8 to 20 trained patients. They are trained by different training programs, such as EURODIS Summer School and the development of medicines. And these patients who have the same disease, they offer their expertise to public or private sponsors of clinical research. So they can advise on the overall program development, in which patients should we start developing the medicine and how. They can also advise on a single clinical trial, and they can advise on all other aspects, on compassionate use, on pricing, on access, etc. They commit to follow up the research over the years, and they can advise several sponsors in their field. And it's really the patient community that appoints their representatives in the community advisory boards. They are not selected by the pharmaceutical companies. The CAB are driven and operated by the patient networks itself. And full confidentiality applies. We have created or participated in the creation of now more than 20 community advisory boards in rare diseases, in cystic fibrosis, in muscular dystrophy, in Dravet syndrome, etc., etc. And there are more to come. And that already represents hundreds of patient advocates who are trained on what it means to organize a clinical trial and who are advising the sponsors of the clinical trial. Just one example of a successful meeting, a community advisory board with cystinosis met with a company that is developing a gene therapy. And in the clinical trial protocol, the children to be enrolled to test the gene therapy had to stop taking their eye drops 2 months before receiving the gene therapy. And for the parents, that was not possible. That was for them a too high risk that crystals would form in the eye, and they thought that their own children, who have been educated their entire life to use the eye drops daily, would be frightened to stop for 2 months. So the company went back to their pharmacologist and they said, you were right, we don't need a washout period at all. So now the gene therapy trial can start thanks to the advice of the parents. The EMA has, the European Medicines Agency, so received clinical trial data from different clinical trials, most of which are conducted outside of the EU, or many patients are from outside of the EU. So there is an important document that I encourage you to read, which is called a reflection paper on ethical and good clinical practices aspects of clinical trials for conducted outside of the EU and submitted in marketing authorization applications to the EU regulatory authorities. It's a guidance on how to prepare the clinical trials which are conducted outside of the EU to increase the chances that European authorities will accept the data. So there is a lot on building capacities and training teams to make sure that the standards applied for clinical trials are understood and used everywhere. To conclude this presentation, I think the engagement of patients and their representatives is important because it's a very effective way to improve the quality of the research, but also the speed of the clinical trials. I looked on the website of the NIH. I think there are almost 350 clinical trials in progress in Serbia for all diseases, but I'm not sure there is a national registry on clinical trials in Serbia, and maybe that is something that could be helpful. The logistics and the capacity building to train centers to run clinical trials are really important. So you really need to have a critical number of clinical trials to attract sponsors of clinical trials. And lastly, Serbia, as you know, is an acceding country to the EU, but so far only one chapter has been opened for negotiation, which is chapter 27 on environment, and it hasn't started on health and research. When it will start, I'm sure there will be many more cooperation on clinical trials, among other topics, between Serbia and the EU, and I thank you for your attention.